Welcome to the third episode of the Bite-Size Critical Realist. Today we will talk about another important critical realist concept, the concept of depth stratification. We begin again with Roy Bhaskar's question, what should the world be like for science to be possible? And if you recall, he first analyzed sense perception. We saw that in his analysis of sense perception, he talked about the fallibility of our perceptions and the mutability of our perceptions. So the fact that our perceptions can be mistaken, the fact that our perceptions can change, really proves that the world is independent of our perceiving. In Bhaskar's word, intransitive. That is his first conclusion in his analysis of sense perception. But he has yet another insight. He talks about our experience of the finitude of our perceptions. In other words, our perceptions are limited. We cannot observe everything. We have not observed everything. Some events in the world have not been experienced or known, or possibly, and in principle, some events cannot be experienced or known. So here, he makes a distinction between experiences and events. There must exist a class of unperceived or unperceivable events. To capture those events that are not necessarily experienced, Bhaskar identifies a domain of the actual, which is distinct from the domain of the empirical. While the domain of the empirical is a set of all events that we experience, the domain of the actual encompasses all events in general, including those that are, for various reasons, not perceived. Note that the domain of the empirical is a subset of the domain of the actual. All experiences are necessarily events that have happened in the world, but not all events have been experienced or perceived. That proverbial tree falling in the woods that no one has witnessed is obviously an event no one has experienced, but you'd better not deny it's a real event just because there were no witnesses. Perception is significant in science precisely because not every event in the world has been or can be experienced. If all events could be experienced, there would be no reason to speak of perception. It would suffice merely to speak of events. By explicitly referring to these two domains of reality, Bhaskar has already begun sketching the critical realist vision of the world as stratified. This analysis of sense perception gives us a glimpse of the stratification of the world, but it is not yet a complete picture. It is only when Bhaskar conducts a similar transcendental analysis of experiments that this picture of the world's stratification becomes complete. In analyzing experimental activity, Bhaskar asks, what should the world be like for experiments to be possible and intelligible? What makes a successful experiment? What is the expected outcome of an experimental activity? What are the conditions required for this outcome and why? In Bhaskar's analysis, an experiment has two necessary and essential ingredients. The first he calls experimental production, and the second he calls experimental control. In conducting an experiment, the scientist creates a desired sequence of events in order to discover causal laws that account for the phenomenon that he or she is investigating. This conjunction of events has been detected in the world, but contrary to Hume's empiricism, is interpreted not so much as already demonstrating causality, but merely as signifying a possible causal law. To verify this, an artificial environment is designed in the laboratory in order to produce the phenomenon to be investigated. The same artificial environment is created to isolate variables that normally interfere with the phenomenon and to prevent them from doing so in the laboratory. This is called experimental control. It is through experimental production and control that causal laws governing a given phenomenon become empirically accessible. So for example, Scientists would add salt to water, expecting the outcome that water will boil at a higher degree. So in the laboratory, the scientists can come up with event A, which is expected to lead to event X. Now here's the important part. The regular sequence of events created in the laboratory cannot be equivalent to the causal law. Why not? If the regular sequence of events were the causal law, then scientists would already know the very causal laws they are seeking to discover in creating the regular sequences of events. Going back to our example, if the scientists already knew that adding salt to water would increase the boiling temperature of the water, if that's the causal law, then there's nothing to find out. The scientist already knows what's causing the increase in the boiling temperature of the water. So for Bhaskar, there must be a distinction between the causal laws that scientists are trying to discover and the patterns of events that they are creating in their experiments. In Bhaskar's analysis, the preceding event in our example, adding salt to water, is not the cause of event X, but its condition. Something else, apart from the addition of the salt to water, is causing the elevation of the boiling temperature of the water. In Bhaskar's analysis, causes belong to a third domain, the domain of the real. So for critical realism, reality is stratified in the sense that it has three distinct domains. The domain of the experiences, or what we call the empirical, the domain of events, or what we call the actual, and finally, the domain of causes, or what we call the real. This diagram tells us a lot about reality. First of all, reality isn't just the sum of all our experiences, not even the sum of all the experiences of the entire human race in all of its history. Reality includes events that have not been experienced or will never be experienced by the human race. But the real is still not exhausted by unexperienced events. The real also includes causes that may not be leading to any event, causes that have not been actualized because they have not been triggered. Now, the depth stratification of reality is a very important concept and a very relevant one because there is a strong tendency among people today to conflate all three domains which should remain distinct. Positivists tend to reduce all of reality to only the domain of the empirical, to only what can be perceived. This is the fallacy of the empirical world, where reality is reduced not only to events, but also to experiences. Here's where Roy Bhaskar critiques empirical realism for its flattened and impoverished sense of reality. It's very much like saying an iceberg is only the tip that's above the water surface, but as we know, that's not even the biggest part of the iceberg. Critical realism teaches us that the empirical tip of reality isn't all of reality. Reality is stratified. When we keep in mind that the world is not equivalent to just the sum of all our experiences of that world, when we remind ourselves that beyond the domain of the empirical, there still lie the domains of the actual and the real, then we will be forced to stretch our horizon for reality, because we have to admit that beneath the empirical tip of the iceberg of reality, there is a whole universe. All this reminds me of a bedtime story rabbit who once asked, "What is real?" One very popular answer today is to see is to believe. As long as we can perceive something in some way, whether we can see it or hear it or touch it, or best of all, measure it, then it must be real. How do we decide if something is real? What is our criterion for reality? According to Bhaskar, there are generally two criteria for reality. The first, the more common one, is what is called the perceptual criterion of reality. If something is perceptible, if something can be detected by our senses, then it must be real. But for Bhaskar, there is a superior criterion for reality, and this is a causal criterion for reality. And the condition for ascribing reality to something is that it should be causally efficacious. In other words, it should be able to affect something even if it's not yet doing that. Now, why does Bhaskar consider the causal criterion for reality as superior to the perceptual criterion for reality? This diagram illustrates his point. While what is perceptible is causal, what is causal is not necessarily perceptible. If we once again refer to Bhaskar's three domains of reality, the portions of the domain of the real, which are beyond the empirical, are just as real, but cannot be perceived. And that's why that rabbit's question about what is real is far more important and far trickier than we sometimes think. So just to recap, science on the one hand is empirical. It uses the fundamental method of observation, and through observation and sense perception, science aims at describing phenomena. But aside from the empirical nature of science, science is also experimental. It seeks to explain phenomena. That means it seeks to identify the causes that give rise to phenomena. Without these two methods, the sciences would neither be empirical nor experimental. Observation or sense perception is possible and will make sense if and only if the world that we observe is intransitive. That is, if the world were not a mere human mental product that we can change according to our whims. Experimental activity, on the other hand, is possible and intelligible if and only if the sequence of events that scientists produce in an experiment is not identical to the causal laws that they are supposed to be trying to discover. That is, if the world is stratified, where there's a distinction among experiences, events, and causes. The world that critical realism infers from its transcendental analysis of experimental activity is characterized by death. In contrast to the empirical realist vision, the critical realist world is far from exclusively empirical. The intransitive world established by Bhaskar's analysis of perception is now, through his analysis of experimental activity, revealed as stratified. The concept of depth stratification extends our vision of the world beyond its empirical tip. As it turns out, our experiences comprise but the tip of the iceberg of reality. There is therefore indeed more to reality than meets the eye. It certainly consists of what we experience, but it also includes actual events that may be beyond our experience, and even more fundamentally, causes that abide in the world even when they produce no outcome. The critical realist idea of depth stratification effectively stretches the horizon of scientific and all investigations to transcend merely empirical events and actual phenomena. Critical realism, therefore, subscribes to an ontology of depth realism that sees beyond surface phenomena, asserting not only the intransitive character of the world, but also, just as importantly, its stratification.